Today we're going to talk a little bit about the foundations of horror games, specifically a 10-year period from about the early 90s to the mid-2000s. Obviously there's been horror games way before that. There's been horror games as long as there's been video games. But we only have an hour today, so I cut it down to the 6 most influential video game franchises from that time period. The ones that really established what we imagine as survival horror today, the ones that influenced the video game industry as a whole, and kind of invented this genre. A lot of the early ones around the time we're going to start with, in like 1990, were point-and-click adventure games. That was huge at the time. Stuff like The Seventh Guest, Phantasmagoria, D, Enemy Zero, those games, Gabriel Knight. It was an easy way to make a video game that was very story-heavy, because if you were doing something that was story-heavy, it was easier to make it more frightening. You know, right? Very scary story. Graphics were not frightening at this time, so that was something they had to work around. And then we get to 1992, and our first game in our series of influential video game series, and that is Alone in the Dark. Alone in the Dark is a game that came from a company called Infogrames, which you would know better now as Atari. At the time, they had someone working as CEO, I believe, who came up with the idea of the deprivation of light. That was the theme he wanted to make a video game about, and he drew a drawing of a man holding a lantern and the lantern in the darkness. Now, the image really inspired a man named Frederick Reynal, who was a horror movie addict. He loved George Romero, Dario Argento, huge fan of horror, and he always wanted to make a zombie horror game. So he saw this, and he was like, that's a horror game right there. I want to do that. And they gave him the go-ahead. So he started working on his horror game, and he decided immediately it had to be in the 1920s. It had to be before technology and flashlights. It had to be when there was no light. They went ahead and made it a restricted mansion out in the wilderness so that you would feel isolated and afraid. And they decided, well, if our graphics aren't going to be pretty and frightening, we're going to have to do other things to scare people. And they came up with sudden and unexplainable deaths. You could be opening a book to read a note and die because something jumped out of the book and killed you. You could be walking down a hallway and the floor would just fall out from under you. Some people really found this incredibly frustrating when the game came out, but the idea was they wanted to come up with something that would make you afraid of everyday things, because they knew they weren't going to be able to make really incredibly frightening looking monsters. Originally the monsters were zombies, but around this time, Infogrames acquired the Call of Cthulhu license, which is a tabletop board game, and then decided, hey, maybe we can make this a Call of Cthulhu game, you think? And Call of Cthulhu people were like, no. This game is not complicated enough for our board game, can't do it. But they ended up making the zombies into Lovecraftian creatures. They also added the idea to choose your own protagonist. You could either pick from a young man or a young woman who were involved in the plot. It was a point-and-click adventure game, but unlike the previous one, it was actually using 3D, which was incredibly new at this time. This is the very birth of 3D video games in the whole industry, not just horror. So what they did was they created polygonal figures for their characters and laid them over top of static images. Originally they wanted to actually use real photographs of an actual mansion, and computer game couldn't handle it. So they turned it into pixel images. The reason was that it really saved on data for their game. It made it a lot easier to program this game and not, you know, cost a lot of money, but it also allowed them to frame their game in a certain way. It would create what we call now the fixed camera. So you'd have a scene where a character walks into a room and the camera would be in a specific corner or a doorway, and it would give it a really cinematic feel, and it would also hide the fact that you were just looking at a photograph. It had a really dynamic musical score, which was really different for the time. They kind of tried to go for something cinematic. It was kind of non-linear. There were aspects that weren't completely, you have to go this way and do this story. And there was a lot less of a focus on combat. You were supposed to try and think of other ways to get through things. You were supposed to try and avoid fighting. All of this was very new to the video game industry, and basically sounds like a lot of horror games that would come after it. And it was a huge success. It came out in 1992, and immediately before it was even out, Infogrames was like, we're making another one. Do it now. And Reynal and his team actually left. The problem they had was Infogrames took his name out of the credits. They didn't want this director getting all this studio with his own folks. But Infogrames went ahead and they made Alone in the Dark 2 and Alone in the Dark 3, and they were good games. They were the same game. They said, we're going to do same engine, same type of story, same type of monsters, put it on an island, it's going to make money. And it did. The problem was that they were already being outpaced by everyone else who had been inspired by their game. Once Alone in the Dark 1 came out, it was really influential. A lot of people loved it, it got really good reviews, and other people looked at it and said, more games, we should do that right now. And they were doing it differently and they were doing it better. So even though Alone in the Dark 2 and 3 weren't necessarily bad, by the time they were ported to the PS1 in 1997, reviewers were saying, this is the same thing, you're not innovating, this is just more the same. And so unfortunately, even though Alone in the Dark did have some more games later on down the line, it's not really that famous anymore. It's kind of died out. Being a protagonist, finding notes in a creepy old mansion where you're locked in and you survive, where you're not supposed to really fight, you have limited inventory and limited lighting, all this stuff really was born in Alone in the Dark. So Alone in the Dark comes out in 1992 and is creating this new genre and stepping away a little bit from the point-and-click games that had been horror games to that point. But there was another video game series that was sticking very closely to the original formula and changing a little bit of its gameplay aspects. They wanted to create a point-and-click horror game that had no combat at all. This series was Clock Tower, a Japanese video game series that was originally created by Hifumi Kono. The very first game never actually came to the West. To this day, you can only play it online with fan translations. It was very heavily inspired by Dario Argento to the point that it is basically a fan fiction of his movie Phenomena. The main character is named Jennifer, for the actress that played the main character of Phenomena, Jennifer Connelly. Both stories are about orphan girls who go to creepy mansions and get attacked by men with scissors. Clock Tower was incredibly successful in Japan, and very different because where other horror games like Alone in the Dark had defocused combat, you can't fight in Clock Tower at all. You explore this mansion in a very flat 2D point-and-click kind of way, and at certain points in time, a man called Scissor Man will jump out and attack you. At that point, you have to run for your life. If you end up being too panicked by the situation, the main character will literally have a panic attack on screen, leaving you more vulnerable to attack. Now, this was invented in this game, but think about all the games we have today that heavily rely upon things like, oh no, your panic meter's rising, things like Amnesia, where your character's behavior changes based on how freaked out they are. Clock Tower invented the idea. So while the first game didn't actually come to the US, the second one did, which here it was only called Clock Tower. And it was basically a sequel to the first game. It had the same ideas, it did pretty well. The second one didn't, and the third one bombed. Clock Tower 3 was incredibly different from the other ones. It was a PS2 game. It came out in about 2002, and it kind of, I'm not entirely certain, but I feel like it was inspired by the game Eternal Darkness, because Eternal Darkness deals with time travel, and Clock Tower deals with time travel. Unlike the previous games that were, you go to a mansion and you're attacked by a supernatural killer, in Clock Tower you go to a mansion, you find magical doors, you travel to the past, then you're attacked by a dead ghost killer who you have to exorcise and then go back to the future and do it all again. It's weird, it's fun, it was a decent game, but it was incredibly different from the other games. It came out at a time when the PS2 was getting so many games of so many kinds, everything was oversaturated, and it sold very badly. Which is possibly why the next game, technically in the series, was not called Clock Tower. The next game is called Haunting Ground. It's actually a spiritual sequel to Clock Tower because it's made by a lot of the same people, and it's basically the same exact idea. You go to this mansion, you're being chased by these horrible people that want to get you, and you have a panic meter. The difference was, this game would actually include a dog as your companion, so there were mild aspects of combat. It was pretty good game. I've actually been lucky enough to play it, and I say lucky enough because the game, again, didn't sell well, and then became a cult classic. So now this game sells online for upwards of $200. It is a good game, but I don't know if it's a $200 good game. Clock Tower had a very small flash-in-the-pan kind of history with video games. It definitely invented a lot of important things. You know, first horror game to have no combat at all, to have a panic system, to focus very heavily on that kind of scenario. But other games would come along and do it better, and Clock Tower never really had the same success that it had with the first game. Much like Alone in the Dark, it kind of died out after that point. Even though Haunting Ground is really considered a cult classic, it's not as heavily associated with Clock Tower because of the difference in name. They did have one more game in the series. Hifumi Kono, the original creator of the first game, crowdfunded a sequel he called Night Cry. It's done decently, and it is basically pure Clock Tower, pure Hifumi Kono, but it hasn't really succeeded the way he wanted it to, and it seems like the Clock Tower series may go the way of Alone in the Dark. Well, that brings us to 1996. And if we actually had a projector, I had a little clip that was just going to go, Resident Evil. Resident Evil actually started development in 1993, which is interesting because remember, Alone in the Dark came out the year before. Capcom came forward and said, we want a horror game. This one's doing good, we want one. Originally, there was a game called Sweet Home in Japan, which was a horror game. It never made it out of Japan, but it was incredibly successful. And the creator of Sweet Home came to Capcom and said, hey, why don't you remake my incredibly popular game? And they were on board. But the director of the project, Shinji Mikami, wanted to create his own thing. So even though Sweet Home ended up being an influence on this project they would make, it would inevitably become a new thing, entirely Mikami's creation. Shinji Mikami had been working there for a couple of years and had directed Disney games like Aladdin and Goof Troop, and that totally prepared him to create a modern horror game. He worked for 6 months by himself on this game. He wrote the script, he created concept art, long before he ever brought anybody else in on the project. Eventually, it was a team of about 20 or 40 people creating this concept, centered around the idea of real horror. He was tired of ghosts and ghouls. He wanted something that felt like it could actually happen to you tomorrow, that it was a physical evil. This is possibly influenced by the fact that the man had an abusive childhood. He lived in a home with a very violent father. So the fact that he created a game called Resident Evil, you know, the evil in your residence, might mean something. It was originally called Biohazard in Japan. Apparently Capcom of America is the one that actually changed the name, and Mikami had nothing to do with it. I have no idea why. So Resident Evil basically took the same concept as Alone in the Dark. They did the 2D static backgrounds, they had 3D polygonal characters, they had a mansion. It was heavily influenced by both Alone in the Dark and Sweet Home. They took the zombie idea, they took the two protagonists idea, they made the mansion incredibly complicated and confusing because they didn't want people to be able to rent it and beat it in a weekend. So,
now we got people to do it in an hour.
Yeah, speedrunners doing it like that. And Resident Evil came out in 1996 and was huge. It had a sequel by 1998. In 1999, a project called Resident Evil 4 began. And it went through 4 different versions before they finalized this game. One of them was actually a very supernatural game, which was canned because, again, Mikami is not a fan of the supernatural kind of evil, which is really weird considering other games that came out from him later. It was actually canceled because it was too like Silent Hill. Resident Evil 4 would come out and be incredibly different from the previous games. It was actually directed by Shinji Mikami, where the other previous 2 were directed by other people while he worked as producer. They focused on the sort of cheesy action aspect of it, and they created the over-the-shoulder camera that would become the, beginning of every shooting game that had an over-shoulder camera. It started with Resident Evil 4. So while the game itself is a little bit controversial in the fan base because it wasn't exactly as horrifying as the previous one,
it's not really as bad as 5 or 6.
Yeah, very true.
Punch some boulders, people.
Yes, it would not be as bad as 5 or 6. It was really revolutionary for its time. And yes, 5 and 6, which came out next, were not great. They were really heavily just shooter games, basically. Very and possibly the fact that they did so badly and they were so action-focused is why Capcom went back to a heavy focus on horror for Resident Evil 7. There's a lot of people that say, oh, PT is why Resident Evil 7 got like this. But Resident Evil 7's development started way before we had even seen or heard of PT. It was another kind of, you go to a house, you get stuck in a place, crazy people in Louisiana try to kill you sort of game. And then, of course, we had after it Resident Evil 2's remake. The Resident Evil series basically did exactly what Alone in the Dark did, much better. They had a much heavier focus on action, but the action was still with limited inventory, with a lot of creatures. You really weren't supposed to stand your ground and fight. You were supposed to try and run. So a lot of the things that Alone in the Dark invented, Resident Evil really polished and made shine. It was heavily compared to Alone in the Dark when it came out by every single magazine and interview ever, to the point that someone asked Shinji Mikami-san, Alone in the Dark has been compared to your game a lot, what do you think? And he said, our graphics kick ass. And that was his whole answer.
He's not wrong.
He's not wrong. Resident Evil today is probably one of the most famous and most influential video game series, even outside of horror, just in general. And it had a lot of influence on survival horror. But it still probably wasn't considered the most frightening survival horror game. That would come next, with a game that was inspired by it in 1999. Which brings us to Silent Hill. Much like Capcom looked at Alone in the Dark and said, we want that, Konami looked at Capcom and said, we want that. They saw the success of Resident Evil and said, we want a 3D horror game. And they went to a man named Keiichiro Toyama. Keiichiro Toyama was my age. He was 26 when they came to him and said, please direct this video game. It was his first time directing, and everyone working under him was a baby at this company. They had been working there for maybe a year, maybe two. These were people that had failed other projects, people that hadn't been doing this for a long time, and they gave them this project and said, do this, and basically left. Konami didn't give them a lot of oversight at all. So the first thing Toyama-san did was, I'm not good at horror. Let's look somewhere else. And he looked at Stephen King. He really liked the book The Mist, which is the story of a small American town that is enshrouded in this terrible fog that monsters come out of. And he said, that's cool. Let's go ask them if we can make this a game. And they said no. So he said, well, I really like the concept. Why don't we just make a small town shrouded in mist? And that's what they did. Now, Konami told them 3D, which meant they wanted 3D characters, 2D background, like Resident Evil, Alone in the Dark. But they realized if they wanted to do this fog idea, they needed a sense of depth. They needed to actually have a town. So they took it a step further, and they made the entire game 3D. This was on the PS1, remember? And it was not beautiful. But the fog was their saving grace because it hid everything. It meant they didn't have to load the whole town. It meant that they didn't have to make it that pretty. And it did add a lot to the horror aspect. They also kept the whole static camera thing, the fixed camera, even though they now didn't have to hide the 2D backgrounds. And it really added a lot of horror to the game. They have a camera that sticks right above you as you run up the stairs of a lighthouse. They have all kinds of really interesting camera angles that were deeply unsettling. To go with their 3D game, they needed 3D cutscenes. And as I said earlier, 3D was incredibly new at this time, and the older people in this industry had no idea. They didn't know what they were doing with 3D. It was these young kids that were learning it. Specifically a man named Takayoshi Sato. He was pretty new at Konami. He had come in and worked on a couple of games as a 3D artist, and his older employees, people above him, would come to him and say, how do I do this? And he'd show them, and then the boss would get the credit. And he got frustrated with that, so he came to his bosses and said, look, I am awesome at this, and I want to be doing it full time. Give me Metal Gear or give me Silent Hill, and I will kick butt. And they said, fine, but you're doing it by yourself. This man worked 15-hour days, sleeping under his desk for almost 2 years to finish 2,000 hours of 3D animation. Every single 3D cutscene in Silent Hill is made by one man. Goes further, he didn't like mocap. They used mocap for the bodies, they did not use it for the faces. He animated every facial expression by hand. which goes a long way to making both Silent Hill 1 and Silent Hill 2 incredibly, deeply upsetting, because all the facial animations are really realistic. Because at the time, mocap could get the movement of skin. It couldn't get muscle. So everything looked really stiff. His looked alive, which is probably why he won 3 awards for this project.
Yeah.
Silent Hill 1 came out in 1999, and it was huge. It was actually debuted at E3, where Toyama-san and everyone else at Konami were crossing their fingers and praying it was going to be good, because they didn't think it was going to be good. And it was beloved. Everybody at E3 was talking about it, because it was completely out of the blue. Probably helped that Metal Gear was also being talked about, so everybody was at Konami's booth anyway. So it comes out, and it did great. So Konami says, you guys did amazing, do whatever you want, we don't care, have all the money. Their team tripled in size from about 15 to 20 people to about 50. And they got started on Silent Hill 2. And this time, Takayoshi Sato, the 3D artist, would be art director. And he was the one that came up with the idea. He had recently read a book, Crime and Punishment, the famous Russian novel we probably all read in high school. And he wanted to do a story based on the idea of a character being a criminal, that they had done something wrong, which is where the idea for Silent Hill 2 came from. The story would be about a man who had actually killed his wife, but he didn't remember he killed his wife until much, much later. So, for their game, they were going to want a big, big monster. In the first game of Silent Hill, a man named Masahiro Ito was working as a monster designer. He actually worked with a woman named Nato Sako, who happened to leave with Keiichiro Toyama, the director of Silent Hill 1. They left along with another teammate to go create Siren. So they didn't have the director of the first game for their second one, but they had Masahiro Ito, who became the art director. So they were trying to come up with this big bad monster, what are we going to do? And he was a very talented man. He draws a lot of incredibly weird looking things that don't have faces. He really likes monsters that don't have faces. And he came up with this idea of, what if it doesn't have a face and it looks like it's going to hurt you if you touch it, with sharp edges? Which is what brought about Pyramid Head. If you look at him, he really is just a person with a triangle on his head. But he doesn't have a face, he doesn't have eyes that you can see, and his sharp edges are definitely sharp and dangerous looking. So the team created this concept, they went forward with this idea, they now had 3D surround sound, they had a lot more money, all the cutscenes were once again not entirely just done by Sato-san, but he insisted that all of the faces were animated by hand. And the game came out. People weren't happy, because this game was not a sequel. It had nothing to do with the first game, nothing to do with the characters, nothing to do with the story. Japan especially hated this game for a long time, and Ito-san, who's very active on Twitter, talks a lot about how his game kind of took a while to become the cult classic that is often seen as today. If you think survival horror, 9 out of 10 people will say Silent Hill 2. It took a long time for them to actually like it. And that's what led to Konami coming to these guys and saying, hey, we trusted you. You did a good job the first time, what happened? We're going to take your team and we're going to give you less money. So, Konami took away some of their team, took away some of their money, and the team looked at each other and said, well, they want a sequel, let's give them one. So for Silent Hill 3, they decided to actually make a direct sequel. Now, unfortunately, Sato-san, 3D director, ended up leaving at this point because Konami didn't pay him, as Konami is Konami, and we all hate him. So he left, and he ended up working in a couple different places. Funny enough, he worked at a place called Virtual Heroes, which is about 30 minutes that way, and he lived in Raleigh for about 7 years. But with him gone, the team was cut down to about 30 people. Masahiro Ito was still there. Masashi Sugiyama was still there. He directed Silent Hill 2. But it's probably because Sato-san was gone that they didn't do 3D cutscenes. The story was about the characters from the first game. It was about the same story, the cult. Pulled all that back together to give people kind of a bookend that fans wanted. And it also invented this really neat concept. One of the programmers created a system that allows you to create 3 layers of images that would move on a surface. So if you play Silent Hill 3, you can walk into rooms where it looks like the walls are writhing with blood. That's a technique they actually invented for this game that had not existed in the industry before that. Unfortunately for them, fans and critics alike were like, this is more of the same. This isn't good, but we're going to complain about it because we're fans and that's what we do. Well, luckily for them, as Silent Hill 3 was being made, they were already working on Silent Hill 4. They had actually divided the team into 2 parts and created a project called The Room, which was basically, okay, Silent Hill 3 is going to be for the fans, this project's going to be for us. They decided, we're going to make this more Japanese, we're going to make this about ghosts, and we're going to make this really gross looking, and they brought all these new ideas and concepts together for a new game they wanted to create. Unfortunately, it was very different, and it was very underfunded. They had to cut bosses, they had to cut puzzles, they had to cut a lot of material that they created because they had about 20 people on this game working for half the amount of time they worked on any of the other games, because Konami is evil. Well, the game comes out, and fans are mad again. Now, funny enough, this is actually the game that is most critically held up to the highest standard. It gets the highest reviews. If you look back at any video game websites at the time, any magazines, of all the Silent Hill games, Silent Hill 4 gets the best reviews. Partially because a lot of people that I think reviewed Silent Hill 2 didn't finish the game, because if you read the reviews, they clearly don't know who James is. So, after Silent Hill 4 didn't do as well as Konami wanted, Konami unfortunately decided to disband what was called Team Silent, the people that made these games. Now at this point, Team Silent was already kind of disbanded because a lot of people had left over the years, but this was the end of Konami creating Silent Hill internally, and the beginning of everyone online screaming about Silent Hill. I mean, they were already, and it got worse. Because all the games started going to the West, and every time they did, the games weren't always the best. Because behind the scenes, Konami was still being evil. And they were saying, you know, there were concepts that came out, like Cold Heart was a concept that they said, no, this sounds too cool, they can't have it. And they interfered a lot with the progress of each of these Western games, to the point of saying, Pyramid Head has to be in it, because he's famous, so you have to have Pyramid Head. Even though the people directing these games were like, he doesn't fit, this doesn't make any sense. Konami insisted. So unfortunately, over the years, there was a lot more of a divisive response to the games that came out in the West, like Homecoming, Silent Hill Downpour, which I honestly really enjoyed, but there was a mixed response to all the games after Silent Hill 1 through 4. Though at the time those games came out, people, you know, generally were more divisive. There were people that didn't like 2, there were people that didn't like 4. Nowadays, they're remembered a lot more fondly because they came before all of this other stuff. Then we get to Silent Hill PT, which I will not cover too much detail because we only have so much time, but Silent Hill PT and the trouble with Hideo Kojima and how Konami mistreated him really brought to light how Konami's been mistreating their people for a long time. I mean, like I said, they made Sato-san work 15-hour days for 2 years. And it led them to try and cover up the whole thing and try and make people forget about it by just getting rid of Silent Hill. And unfortunately, it looks like that's how it's going to be for a while. I actually watched a presentation at E3 this year where Konami said they were going to announce something. And I was watching it live on Twitch, and watching the Twitch channel comments go by, dozens of people, Castlevania, Silent Hill, let's go. I don't know why I'm hoping. I hope something comes out. And then they announced a retro console, and I can't repeat what was said in the chat, but it was not happy. Unfortunately, that's how Konami is, and that is probably how Silent Hill is going to be for a long time. But to this day, Silent Hill is probably the most influential horror game. If you look at any indie game, if you look at most of the horror games that come out today, the person that made them go, yeah, I played Silent Hill. Silent Hill was a big influence on me. You know, the games that came before it had invented a lot of the tropes and ideas like the fixed camera and the finding notes everywhere kind of thing. But Silent Hill perfected it and really created a strange kind of horror and desire that made this game more than a lot of the other games that came out. I mean, Silent Hill 2 dealt with things that no game had dealt with at the time. Incest, rape, sexual assault, a ton of things that games hadn't dealt with and which some games today don't even deal with. So it was definitely a very big, influential series for the industry, though unfortunately it looks like we may have seen the end of it.
You know what movie it was based off? It was based off the Mist of Volcano movie influenced it.
There were a ton of movies that influenced it. Which one are you thinking of?
Jacob's Ladder.
Yes, Jacob's Ladder, which is actually, they're remaking Jacob's Ladder, and that's Masahiro Ito's favorite movie. He cannot stop talking about that on Twitter. Alright, so the next series we're going to talk about comes out around 2001. And This was the director looking at Silent Hill and saying, wow, that is neat. I want to do that. And that director was Makoto Shibata. He was working with a game series called Tecmo's Deception, and did pretty good. It was the beginning of its own horror game series. But at that point, he was given his own project. And he decided for that project, he wanted to work on a horror game. And he wanted to work on a horror game about ghosts. Because this man was haunted, in his own words. I'm not going to stand up here and say I believe in ghosts. I'm not going to say they aren't real. But Makoto Shibata believes from his childhood that he was heavily haunted by ghosts. And he created this game wanting to deal with the horror of ghosts and being haunted by these things that you can't see or touch. When the art director asked him what should they look like, he said, they should look like the ones I see in my dreams. Which is a really funny thing to say to an employee, but... So they created this idea, and they wanted to make it an incredibly Japanese experience. Because Silent Hill was a really great game, but it was a Western town, it was a lot of Western influences. They said, nope, we're going to go back to Japanese horror. We're going to go to The Ring, The Grudge. They watched a bunch of old war movies, and came up with Fatal Frame. Fatal Frame, if you watch it, which I unfortunately brought video, but it really does look like an old war movie. The way it's discolored, the grittiness on it, the camera, the framing. They took a lot of influence from that kind of film. The idea was you wanted to face your fears. Because a lot of these other horror games were about running and hiding, or trying to shoot a zombie. In Fatal Frame, you play as a young person, usually a young girl who has a camera that can defeat or chase off the ghosts. But to use the camera, you have to pick it up and look at the ghost. You have to stand your ground and take a picture. So, you had to face your fear. That was the idea they had behind Fatal Frame. Fatal Frame was created in Japan, and in Japan they have a tradition. If you work on a game or a movie or a television show about ghosts, they usually have a religious figure in the community come in and bless the area, because they have Shinto beliefs and belief about spirits and such. Fatal Frame's team said no. They said they didn't want this blessing, and you know, Shibata-san believed he was haunted, and the team had some weird things happen while this series was being made. The director kept finding long woman's hair in his house. He had short hair and was dating no one. They found a ghost hanging in the middle of a scene in the game, like a man's feet hanging from the ceiling, and they were like, we didn't program that, we don't know how to get rid of this. And then they finished the game and he was gone. There is a scene in the Japanese audio where a woman whispers brother, and it's not in the dialogue. Still in the game, if you play it, you can hear this voice. All these kind of very weird, strange things happened where Shibata-san really did believe he was haunted, and a lot of the other team members were coming around to the idea that he was haunted. Unlike a lot of these horror game series, Fatal Frame has basically had the same team at its core this whole time. Fatal Frame 2 is the most famous. It's generally on every single best of horror games kind of list. Shibata-san was involved with the writing and directing of nearly all these titles. Fatal Frame 3 was the next to come, and it was also on PS2. The first three are probably the most successful, but they did keep going. They created another one on the Wii, which didn't come out over here. It kind of took advantage of the Wii motion stuff. They actually created a game called Spirit Camera, which was for the DS. And they created, the last game was for the Wii U, called Maiden of Black Water. The interesting thing about Fatal Frame is that none of these games really succeeded or failed. Like, Fatal Frame's just kind of chugged along all this time, just making it, like, they're still, just came out in 2015. It has had kind of a more sedate and quieter influence on the industry. It has definitely been there since the beginning, and I hope will be there for a while longer. Well, now we're getting to about 2001, to our last video game series, and this one's a little different, because it doesn't exactly fit under the whole umbrella that we've been talking about so far, where we've been talking about survival horror, a lot of games that really focus on horror, but it was born from this genre and kind of opened the door for more games that were horror adjacent, and that is Devil May Cry. Devil May Cry was actually a version of Resident Evil 4. Like I said earlier, Resident Evil 4 went through many versions. One of them became Devil May Cry. The reason was they kind of invented this gameplay concept centered on the idea of coolness. They really liked this idea, and And the team was chugging along working on this idea, and Mikami-san looked at it and said, this is not Resident Evil. And the man that was working on this project was Hideki Kamiya. And he was trying to convince Kamiya-san, this is a cool project, but it shouldn't be Resident Evil. And for 6 months, Mikami-san fought to get this project approved to be its own thing, and finally got the go-ahead to make Devil May Cry. It would be really different than Resident Evil. It was more mission-based. It was really heavily focused on flashy combat. They actually had this glitch happen in a different game where if you kept hitting a character in midair, they would stay in midair. And Kamiya really liked that. He was like, that is so cool. And it created the center of Devil May Cry's combat where you swing up and you hit a thing in the air and then keep hitting it for style points. The center of their combat was aerial combat and coolness. They also focused very heavily on making the game incredibly difficult.
Yes.
It is very difficult. Kamiya-san wanted it to be less easy. You couldn't just pick it up and play it. You really had to dedicate yourself to it. And it was popular. Devil May Cry did very well. And unknown to Kamiya-san, until Capcom told him way later, they were already making Devil May Cry 2. He was like, but I'm here. What? What? And to this day, we really don't know who made Devil May Cry 2. Hideaki Itsuno is credited with Devil May Cry 2, and he came in at the end of the project to kind of try and save it. Because Devil May Cry 2 is bad. Devil May Cry 2 had 2 major weaknesses. It was easy, and it wasn't about Dante. Because Dante was this really cool and fun and hip character, and in the second game, he really just didn't come across that way. It was incredibly kind of dark. It was a lot more traditional, just your grumpy, you know, I'm gritty and I'm sad and I'm Batman. Kind of Batman. It was boring. It wasn't Dante.
He had a coin, so more like Harvey Dent.
Yeah, he had a coin, right. So it didn't do as well at all. And Capcom went, oops, our bad, and let Hideaki Itsuno save the series with Devil May Cry 3. Devil May Cry 3 would come out and be incredibly difficult because after the complaints with Devil May Cry 2, they changed Japan's hard mode to the Western normal mode. And it's the only DMC game I have never finished because I was 15 and I returned it to GameStop. But it was really great. It was not actually really written by Kamiya. He gave permission to one of his co-workers to kind of create the background of Virgil and some of the story stuff. But it was inevitably the reason the series survived. Itsuno would continue to go on to make DMC4, which was also a best-selling game. It was a little weaker because it reused a lot of sets. You played through the game twice as 2 different characters, and you went through the same places. Now, you could do that in a game. Kingdom Hearts is a great example of a series that does that well. But Devil May Cry didn't really make it very fresh. So DMC4 wasn't as successful as the 3rd one, but it was still successful. Now, at this point, the timeline of DMC series was a little wibbly-wobbly because it actually, DMC3 was a prequel to DMC1, and then they decided DMC4 was a prequel to DMC2 because DMC2 actually ends with Dante driving into hell. So the game timeline was 3, 1, 4, 2. 4 also introduced some mysteries. 4 introduced the mystery of this character named Nero, who appeared to be related to Dante, and we didn't know why. There was a lot of things going on that was like, he was in hell, he's got this nephew maybe, what's going on? We don't know what's going on. So Capcom said, Itsuno-san, you can't have this series anymore, we're going to give it to these Westerners, and they're going to reboot it. Screw answering the mysteries, screw finishing this series, we're going to reboot it.
We don't speak of it.
Unfortunately, that's what they did. And Itsuno-san was still on the project. He was working as like a creative producer over the Western team, which was Ninja Theory. Now, a lot of people play this game, and there's a big fan base for it. But unfortunately, during development of that game, there was a lot of controversy because the man who directed it is a madman. He came on an official stage at like an event like E3 and complained about how DMC was bad and he was going to make it good again.
Really?
Yes, he complained about this. Yes, there was a lot of controversy at the time, especially because he changed the way Dante looked too. He was sort of like a skinny, black-haired kind of guy who kind of looked like the director. And yes, And they took a lot of aspects that made DMC really cool and kind of got rid of it. He basically said, Isuno-san, this game, this project he worked on for so long, because he directed 2.5 of the games, it's not good, and I'm going to make it my way, which that happens when you do a reboot. You're going to create your own spin, but he was really disrespectful about it. He actually made a comment, because in DMC4, Dante wears chaps. He said, Dante is not a gay cowboy. He said that on stage. So in DMC5, which is Itsuno-san's project, there is a scene where Dante gets a cowboy hat and starts dancing to Michael Jackson. I kid you not. And even though Itsuno-san has said, oh, we're fine, we're okay, we're happy, the fact that that scene is in there says a lot about how he felt about those people and the way they treated him.
Okay. I mean, there was a scene in DMC where the white wig hits.
Yes, there was a scene where in the reboot game where a white wig falls on him, so for a minute he looks like the real Dante, and then he goes, nah, that's cool, and he takes it off. It was very disrespectful. They were ridiculous. A lot of people still like that game, and that's fine. I think a lot of people that didn't grow up with DMC kind of went into it and they didn't know the controversy, and that's fine. Just for me personally, I hate how that man behaved. But Itsuno-san at that point was going to walk. He was no longer interested in working for Capcom, and Capcom came on bent knees saying, please, what can we do? And he said, give me back Devil May Cry right now. And they did. And he made DMC5, which is currently my favorite game of this year. It is very good. It managed to save the series. It answered a lot of questions. It still kind of left us with some things to think about. It was really fun to play. It was a really great game. And what Devil May Cry really did is it was a horror game that wasn't frightening. It was cool, because all these horror games were about being afraid and being powerless, where DMC said, you are the most badass person on the planet. Face all these horrors right now. And so now you think about all the games that are really heavily focused on becoming a really badass character, really fighting against a heavy difficulty, like Bloodborne and Dark Souls. The heavy difficulty of DMC was way ahead of its time. And fighting in a situation where you're in a horror situation, but you are this super cool character, it really opened up the door to say we can make horror games that aren't entirely about just being terrified all the time. Brings us to the end of our presentation. That is the 6 series that are the most influential on horror. There are a lot of other influential horror games, but these are the games that in the early years really gave us the ideas that are at the foundation of the survival horror genre. And even though maybe they're not all perfect, or they're not all as beautiful, or they aged a little badly, they still deserve our respect for bringing us to where we are today. Thank you guys so much for listening. Are there any questions? I really like Sea of Solitude just came out, and that was very good. It's not entirely scary, but it definitely deals with issues of depression and horror and monsters. It's very good. Severed for the DS and the Switch is really good. I really like that one. I haven't played a lot of indie horror because I've been working on catching up on all the horror I missed. But there's a lot of good stuff out there. Anything else?
Personal recommendation, although it's hard to find out, but there's this whole thing around Devotion.
Yes.
The newest game came out. Like, if you have a PC, it's easy to find, even if it's not on Steam.
He's talking about a game called Devotion, which was made by a Chinese developer that got in trouble with the Chinese government, and the game's no longer on Steam. You can still find it online, but I've heard that it is incredibly good.
As a Silent Hill fan, what's your opinion of Shattered Memories? Because the fans were split on that.
Shattered Memories is the only one I've probably only played once, and it's not anything against the game. I sold my PSP. I enjoyed it. I thought it was a really fresh and new idea. My favorite is still Silent Hill 4, which puts me in a small camp, but I really love that game a lot.
Also on top of that, what did you think of the movies?
The movies are actually how I got into Silent Hill.
Okay.
I was like 12 at the time, and luckily my mother didn't pay much attention to what I put in the shopping cart because I came home with the movie, and that's what got me into it. I think the first movie is a solid alternate universe, and the second one is an entertaining B-horror movie that's not good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's make Pyramid Head the good guy.
And he fights Sonic Harris. Yeah, anyway.
So the Until Dawn developers are making a new horror game.
I didn't know.
Yeah, I'd look it up actually. So since you don't know about that, I should probably ask instead, how do you feel about Until Dawn as a horror game?
I haven't finished playing it yet. Until Dawn is kind of, you play a bunch of like teenagers in a horror movie that go to a house and then everybody starts getting killed and your actions define what happens in the story. It's a really neat concept. It's got a big cult following and I've enjoyed it so far.
Say that it wasn't pulled off well, so I was wondering what your opinion on.
Well, I've not finished it, so I can't say yet.
It does have that experience. Is there any horror subgenres or ideas or tropes that haven't been explored yet that you'd like to see explored?
Personally, I think there's something in Silent Hill where they take some inspiration from the Alice in Wonderland books, but I think there's more you could do there. Like the situation of having a small child explore a horrific scenario like that would be really interesting, but I think developers would shy away from that right now with, I guess Limbo is kind of like that a little bit. Yeah, that's something I'd like to see more of. Yes, I've seen that. You play as a toddler that's kind of exploring through the house and through some dreams, I think. It's been a while since I played it.
Because you're in his perspective, like the normal house looks really creepy, and I haven't played a whole lot of it, but like it did freak me out. But there's not a lot of jump scares or anything like it's mostly like crawling around, hearing weird noises and not knowing what they are because you're a baby.
Yeah, Among the Sleep is really atmospheric, and it's kind of short, so you can probably just enjoy it in a weekend. It's good, yeah. Anything else? All right, well, thank you guys for joining me. Please, if you haven't, take some business cards. I am a professional YouTuber. I stream every day, and I make videos about the history of Silent Hill, the symbolism of video games, all that kind of stuff. I also have books on Silent Hill 1 and 2, which you can come up and look at if you'd like, and also purchase if you'd like. And thanks again for joining me, and have a good weekend, and a great GalaxyCon.